Pac would have boxed him. Pac would have loved to beat his ass in the ring, raise some money, and give it to the hood. The boy Puffy called me though. Puffy called me back in the day. He called me. He was like, "I just want you to know I ain't have nothing to do with your brothers. You know, I know who you are, but we never met. And I just want to call you man to man to let you know that I ain't have nothing to do with your brothers." Now, why was he calling me, reaching out to me?
Someone just used Shakur's name as a threat, and the silence afterward is louder than any confession. Everyone thought this story was sealed in the 1990s, reduced to memorials and documentaries, until it suddenly started moving again in real time. What surfaced this week is a lawsuit allegation spreading fast, tied to a private warning that invokes Shakur not as history, but as proof of reach, followed by sudden non-responses and closed comments that feel defensive. At the same moment, insiders are pointing to resurfaced interview statements and documentary material alleging a $1 million bounty tied to the Vegas shooting, while a key suspect sits locked into a February 9, 2026 trial date. Suge Knight is again accusing Snoop Dogg of knowing too much. Snoop Dogg is calling it lies tied to death row ownership, and Sean Diddy Combs' name is reappearing in claims about money, intimidation, and control. The official version says this is all noise, yet the timing is wrong, the reactions are wrong, and the fear feels current. If Shakur's legacy is still being used to keep people quiet, then the real fallout hasn't started yet.
Three law firms on retainer. I don't know how much money is coming in, but I know that a lot of money is going out every single month for Diddy.
What people point to first is the clean version, the one that has been repeated so long it feels finished. A late summer night in 1996, a boxing match, an altercation in a casino lobby, then a drive-by on a Las Vegas street. That explanation still circulates because it is simple and because it keeps responsibility narrow. It says this ends with street retaliation and bad timing, nothing more. But even inside that version, details immediately start pressing against each other. The person beside him in the car survives with minor injuries while he does not. He is not wearing the protective gear he is known to use. The scene is crowded, yet no clear eyewitness emerges. He remains alive for days afterward, long enough for people to visit, to talk, to argue about what condition he is really in. And while the public is told everything is understood, no one is ever formally held accountable. That unresolved gap is not new, but it matters now because it is the same gap being pried open again by lawsuits, resurfaced statements, and a trial date that forces old versions of the story back into circulation.
In the past, before telling me exactly who shot Tupac, Biggie, because I'm curious, the detective that did the background on this, you're going to be glued to the phone to hear what Suge has to say.
Once attention shifts from the night itself to what happens after, the tone changes. Hospital accounts conflict in ways that never fully settle. Official measurements recorded after the fact do not line up with what friends and collaborators insisted they knew. An autopsy image circulates online for years with people arguing over whether it is even authentic. The man responsible for the cremation reportedly retires immediately and vanishes from public view. These are not details that prove anything on their own, but they linger because they never receive clean answers. They sit there waiting for context. That is why, when former associates start hinting that he was conscious, joking, or even improving days after the shooting, those statements do not fade. They collide directly with the idea that everything followed a predictable medical decline. The longer that contradiction exists, the easier it becomes for insiders to whisper that the public timeline is a convenience, not a record. This is where the story stops being only about survival and starts becoming about movement. According to claims that have circulated for years and now resurface in force, there's talk of a rapid extraction plan already in place before the shooting ever happens. Private aircraft, trusted pilots, a route that moves him out of the country within hours of leaving the hospital. Barbados appears as a waypoint in these stories, not as a destination, but as cover, before the trail allegedly goes cold in Cuba. The reason given is always the same. A hit is out, and staying visible is no longer an option. The idea sounds cinematic until people realize how often the same location comes up from different mouths, years apart, without coordination. It becomes harder to dismiss when his aunt is already living there under political asylum, and locals claim they see a familiar face moving quietly through Havana streets. The rumor survives because it offers an answer to a question the official story never resolves. Where did all the certainty go?
Does that give you any closure? Or, what does that do for you to see that? Because I can imagine it could be very conflicting.
Yeah, because I don't champion putting young black men in jail.
Right.
Jail, period. That ain't. But
At the same time, these survival claims circulate. A darker set of allegations keeps surfacing on a parallel track, one that treats the shooting not as a failed attempt, but as a completed contract. According to resurfaced interview material and documentary reporting, a former gang figure describes a $1 million bounty offered to eliminate both him and the man driving the car that night. The money is allegedly promised, never delivered, and routed through intermediaries tied to the music business rather than the street. Those statements sit mostly ignored for years, until federal documents and streaming releases pull them back into view. What changes the temperature now is not just the accusation, but the calendar. A trial is scheduled for early February 2026, and suddenly the people named in those old interviews are no longer theoretical villains. They are living reputations with something to lose, watching a courtroom get closer. The public feud unfolding alongside this only sharpens that pressure. Suge Knight, speaking from behind bars, keeps returning to the same claim, that Snoop Dogg knew more than he ever admitted, and that money was put up to make the problem disappear. Snoop Dogg responds in the open, dismissing it as bitterness tied to his ownership of Death Row Records, calling the accusations lies and framing them as revenge. On the surface, it looks like two aging rivals trading insults. Underneath, industry sources say it feels like positioning. Who gets blamed if testimony expands? Who looks cooperative? Who looks cornered? The fight matters because it drags the narrative out of the past and into the present, where statements can be used, replayed, and interpreted by people with legal authority rather than fans.
That boy life is dangerous. His life isn't, and he just not dangerous with the they said he was doing, but he's in danger. He know too much.
One detail from that period keeps resurfacing because it refuses to sit quietly. Snoop Dogg is supposed to be in the car that night and is not. Accounts differ on why. Some point to a falling out days earlier, fueled by loyalty disputes and radio comments. Others focus on fear, describing how he allegedly travels separately afterward, sleeping under blankets with utensils for protection. None of these details prove intent, but they add texture to the moment, just before everything breaks. People close to the situation say absence is sometimes louder than presence. If everyone is calm, plans stay intact. If people sense danger, they scatter. The fact that someone so closely associated with the inner circle chooses distance right before the shooting becomes one of those facts that never resolves, only accumulates meaning. As these disputes play out, another voice keeps intruding from the margins, the people who claim to have helped him leave. One former security figure goes as far as saying he personally participated in a body swap at the hospital, paying staff to switch records and remove him from public view. He describes flight manifests, co-pilots, and hand signals exchanged between men who later also vanish from the narrative. For years, this is treated as noise. Then, after promising to release proof, that same man is reported gone himself in late 2018. The timing sends conspiracy communities into overdrive, but it also quietly alarms people in the industry who understand how stories are usually shut down. Proof is rarely answered with rebuttal. It is answered with silence.
You know, and with this arrest of Keefe D, brought more questions. You know what I mean? And and there was some answers with that. So it has to be looked at.
All of this lands differently now because of what happens outside the music world. A civil lawsuit filed years after an alleged private assault includes a chilling line. The accuser says he is warned to stay quiet, with Shakur's shooting invoked as an example of what happens when people talk. That allegation does not require anyone to believe every detail. It only requires acknowledging that his name is still being used as leverage. Lawyers note that claims like that immediately complicate timelines and explanations for silence, forcing courts to consider fear as a factor rather than consent. The effect ripples outward. People start asking why a tragedy from the 1990s is still potent enough to intimidate someone decades later, and who benefits from that reputation staying intact. As February 2026 approaches, the question is no longer whether the story will resurface, but which version will survive once people start speaking under oath. Once you step back from the single night and start looking at the pattern that stretches before and after it, and the shape of the situation changes. Long before Vegas, there is already a fracture that never heals, a moment when trust inside the circle collapses and never quite gets rebuilt. People close to Shakur insist that from that point forward, he moves like someone who believes danger is coordinated, not random. He speaks openly about betrayal without naming names, hinting that proof exists but is being held back deliberately. That choice alone matters. In this world, silence is rarely about forgiveness, it is about leverage. When someone says they are keeping something between me and him, insiders read that as a warning, not restraint. It suggests a balance that only holds as long as both sides understand what could be released. That tension sits quietly for years, overshadowed by music and spectacle, but it never disappears. It becomes the context for everything that follows, including why later accusations land so heavily, even without new paperwork attached to them.
Satisfied. I don't feel like I've ever embarrassed myself or my people, in nothing that I've done. And yet and all, I got the whole world fearing me, you know what I'm saying? At 23. Weighing 160 pounds, you know what I'm saying? And I ain't even started. I haven't even wrote my plan out yet, and they scared. I got the vice president know who I am, the president, every cop in every city, you know what I'm saying?
inside the business machinery around that era, people describe an environment where rivalry is not just tolerated, but engineered. Former executives and associates talk about humiliation as a management tool, about pitting talent against each other to consolidate control. According to those accounts, loyalty is demanded publicly, while resentment grows privately. When journals kept by a former insider surface decades later, what draws attention is not any single allegation, but the obsession with documentation, expenses logged, travel arranged in odd ways, decisions that make little sense unless the goal is deniability. People who have worked at that level say that is how you hide intent, bury it inside routine logistics. When those notes are later shown in a streaming release and paired with taped statements from street figures, the effect is cumulative. It creates the impression of parallel worlds briefly touching, then separating again before anyone can point a finger. That impression becomes more disturbing as time passes, because it implies design rather than chaos. The story widens further when you place the aftermath alongside what happens to others orbiting the same power center. Another star from that era meets a similar end months later, after warnings, after travel decisions that insiders claim were unnecessary. Public grief follows, but behind the scenes there are disputes about money, contracts, and who pays for what. One former partner claims the funeral is turned into a recoupable expense, billed back to the very estate it is meant to honor. Whether or not that detail is accurate, its persistence matters because it reinforces a single idea. Everything is transactional. Loyalty has a price. Silence has a price. Even tragedy has a ledger. When investigators later say that cooperation stalls, that people stop returning calls, sources suggest it is not confusion, but fear of reopening both cases at once. The implication is simple and chilling. Solve one, and you start pulling threads on the other.
I know Jake gonna get down where he mad at, or take it to a place where they can get down and ain't nobody can break it up, you know? So I get over there. It's Jake. There's another dude I know named Wolf.
This is why the resurfacing of taped interviews and alleged federal summaries hits differently now. The claims are not new, but the environment is. When a former gang figure describes meetings with music executives and promises of payment, people do not just hear an accusation, they hear a motive chain that connects money, pride, and retaliation. The detail that payment is allegedly never delivered adds another layer. It suggests a deal that goes wrong, not because of conscience, but because of calculation. Industry sources say that unpaid obligations are often more dangerous than fulfilled ones because they leave people talking. When those same sources point out that the speaker is now facing a courtroom calendar, anxiety becomes visible. Accusations of attempted bail efforts surface, framed as concern, loyalty, or charity, depending on who's asked. Skeptics read it as panic. Supporters call it compassion. The ambiguity only raises the stakes. What complicates everything is how openly the conflict now plays out. Suge Knight continues to speak, despite the risks, as if daring someone to contradict him under oath. Snoop Dogg responds with dismissal and confidence, pointing to business success and ownership as proof that old rivals are simply bitter. Sean Diddy Combs stays quieter in public, even as his name keeps appearing in filings, documentaries, and whispered conversations. People close to him insist the silence is strategic, a refusal to legitimize noise. Others say it looks like calculation, an effort to avoid statements that could be revisited later. In this environment, every post, every deleted comment, every refusal to engage becomes part of the evidence pool, not because it proves guilt, but because it reveals fear thresholds. When someone feels untouchable, they talk. When they do not, they lawyer up.
And they was getting a lot of money to make albums and records. When they had guys down south that these labels was paying $250,000, $300,000 on record deals, and these guys was bringing back platinum albums and everything like that. So what they had to do was they had to keep New York rappers.
That brings the story back to the present moment, where civil lawsuits introduce an entirely different pressure system. In one filing, an accuser explains years of silence by describing a private warning that invokes Shakur's shooting as an example of what happens when people speak. Legal analysts note that such an allegation instantly reframes delay as intimidation rather than indifference. It also turns Shakur's legacy into something weaponized, a shorthand threat understood without explanation. That matters because it shows the power of the story itself. Even without proving who did what decades ago, the myth of consequence is still strong enough to shape behavior. People who grew up in the industry say that is how control actually works. Not through constant action, but through reputation. Once a name becomes synonymous with irreversible outcomes, it polices conversation on its own. Meanwhile, the survival narrative refuses to fade. Not because everyone believes it, but because it answers questions nothing else does. Claims of a staged passing, a swapped body, and a quiet life in Cuba persist precisely because they offer an explanation for contradictions that never resolve. Why measurements differ. Why hospital accounts conflict. Why no one is ever formally held responsible. Why alleged proof carriers disappear or retreat. Locals in Havana continue to claim sightings. Photographs circulate, are debunked, then replaced by new ones. Each iteration keeps the idea alive. Industry veterans privately admit they do not know what to believe, only that the persistence itself is suspicious. If the goal were to bury the rumor, it would have been starved of oxygen long ago. Instead, it keeps resurfacing, often just as legal or media pressure intensifies elsewhere.
Now, I ain't trying to say that's some kind of conspiracy, and maybe some other shit was going on, or this, that, and the third. But brother, he had that conversation with K. Slade 2 weeks before he was murdered.
The emotional toll of all this becomes visible in the people left behind. Former collaborators from that era struggle publicly with mental health and despair, posting messages about endurance and hope before their own tragic endings. When someone from the original circle is lost, the reactions are raw and revealing. Public condolences mix with private guilt. Silence from some quarters is interpreted as respect, from others as avoidance. Every absence is scrutinized. Every appearance is parsed. It creates an atmosphere where grief and suspicion coexist, feeding off each other. People begin to wonder whether survival in that world requires forgetting, and whether those who cannot forget eventually collapse under the weight of it. As February 2026 draws closer, the sense of inevitability grows. Legal filings pile up. Documentary producers hint at additional unreleased material. Former insiders give interviews where they choose words carefully, stopping short of direct accusation while making sure listeners understand the implications. The pressure is not about solving a mystery anymore. It is about controlling fallout. Who will be named? Who will be questioned? Who will suddenly remember things they once claimed to forget? The machinery that once kept everything compartmentalized now looks fragile, held together by silence agreements and mutual fear rather than loyalty.
Intelligent, kind, caring, compassionate, a man of God, a man of family and friends, and that's the kind of friend.
By the time you reach this point, the story no longer feels like a question of whether Shakur was targeted by the streets, the industry, or both. It feels like a question of what kind of system allows a single event to generate decades of fear, lawsuits, feuds, and rumors without ever resolving itself. Is the truth buried because it is too messy to surface, or because it implicates too many people at once? Why do the same names keep circling the same accusations, even as time passes and fortunes change? And if Shakur's name can still be used as a warning today, what does that say about who still believes the old rules apply? Drop your thoughts and theories in the comments, because this story is clearly not finished, and the next move is coming whether anyone is ready or not.